The alarm clock blared at 5:30 a.m., as it did every day. Mark Harrison reached out to silence it before it could wake his young son, Leo, sleeping in the bed next to him, in their tiny apartment's only bedroom. He rubbed his eyes, heavy from too little sleep, and rose with the careful quiet of someone who had turned silence into an art form. Dawn's light barely filtered through the window as Mark, or Marky as everyone called him, heated water for coffee. The morning ritual was always the same: prepare Leo's packed lunch, check his backpack, and make sure his uniform was ironed. His hands, rough from constant work, moved with mechanical precision. "Leo, my love, it's time," Mark whispered, stroking his 8-year-old son's messy hair. He stirred in the worn but clean sheets, mumbling that he wanted 5 more minutes. "We can't be late today, sweetheart. Remember, I have a double shift at the factory," he explained, helping him to his feet. Mark worked as an operator in a textile factory across Yorkshire, England. His salary barely covered rent, food, and Leo's school supplies. Each month was a battle against numbers, a silent war he had fought alone since Leo's father abandoned them when the boy was just 2 years old. By 6:45 a.m., mother and son left their apartment in a working-class neighborhood of Leeds. The commute to Oakwood Primary School took 40 minutes by public transport, a bus and then a tram, always packed with people who, like them, woke early to make a living. "Be good, all right? Mrs. Clark will pick you up today because I'll be late," Mark reminded him, kissing his son's forehead before dropping him off at the school gate. Leo nodded, hugging his mother tightly before running towards the playground where his classmates were already playing. 6 years after the divorce, he saw her again. And the boy? His exact copy. London was alive that afternoon, like few other times. The sky, a dense blue bleu, seemed to press down on the city's ancient rooftops with an almost solid light. The narrow, winding streets, curved like unresolved memories, echoed with the hurried footsteps of tourists and locals, voices mingling in different languages, laughter, camera clicks, distant bells. And in the midst of that history-saturated scene, there he was. Alexander Sterling walked aimlessly, his shoulders stiff, his hands in the pockets of his gray coat, his forehead slightly furrowed. His phone vibrated in his trousers, but he didn't take it out. Not today. It was his divorce anniversary. 6 exact years since he signed those papers with black ink and cold hands. Not that he counted, but he knew. His body knew. He had allowed himself a walk through the old city purely by instinct, or perhaps as punishment. He had avoided these streets since Eleanor left, since her name became a kind of ghost whispering through the windows of the empty house. But something that afternoon drew him back. Maybe it was the smell of autumn, maybe the silence behind the noise, or just the weight of a solitude that no longer surprised him. He slowly walked up Angel Street. His eyes scanned wavy glass shop windows, stone walls with moss, children running with ice cream dripping from their fingers. He stopped in front of a used bookstore, took out an old copy of T.S. Eliot, and flipped through it without reading. The paper smelled of time. Poetry, if it still lived there. No longer touched him. That's when everything stopped. Not time, but something inside him. An invisible force turned his face to the side, as if a silent hand pushed his chin. And he saw. There, a few meters away, walking in the opposite direction, was she. Eleanor. The name formed in his mind with the weight of a contained blow. She hadn't seen him yet. She walked distractedly, holding the hand of a child who must have been 5, maybe 6 years old. The boy looked around with a serene curiosity, his face slightly furrowed. his body leaning to one side as if trying to absorb the world. Alexander felt his knees give way by an inch. The boy was his spitting image, not a vague or generic resemblance. It was him. Those intense brown eyes, too large for his face. That slightly arched eyebrow, like someone carrying questions he doesn't yet know how to form. The firm chin. The way he walked, hands loose, steps sure, a slight forward tilt of his neck, as if he was always listening to what he didn't say. Eleanor looked to the side and saw him. There was no startle, no gasp, no quick turn. She simply paused for a second, her eyes locked onto his with a mute, indecipherable force. It wasn't rage, nor fear. It was something more solid, a wall of silence between two worlds that once loved each other, and who now looked at each other as strangers. Alexander took a step. His heart pounded so hard he felt his temples throb. He opened his mouth. The word was about to come out, but the air seemed to vanish. "Eleanor?" he tried, but the voice didn't reach his lips. She squeezed the boy's hand more firmly, looked away, and started walking. Not fast, not hurried, but with an irreversible decision, like someone closing a door silently. Alexander wanted to run. He wanted to shout. He wanted to call the boy's name without even knowing what it was. But his legs wouldn't obey. They were rooted to the ground like the roots of a rotten tree. Everything inside him screamed, but his body refused to react. The crowd grew. Tourists with colorful hats, students with backpacks, a couple laughing loudly, a dog barking. And in seconds, she was gone, disappeared like smoke in the middle of the street. He looked everywhere, turned his body, searched desperately, but there was no sign. Neither of the woman nor the child. Nothing. Only the echo of a life he didn't know existed. He leaned against a stone wall, trying to breathe. His chest ached, not like a heart attack, but as if his ribs had been pried open with bare hands and something torn from within. He broke out in a cold sweat. His hands trembled. He tried to rationalize. Maybe he was mistaken. Maybe the boy just resembled him. Children resemble each other. It wasn't certainty. But then he remembered the eyes. Those intense brown eyes, identical to his own when he was the same age. And there was no way to pretend. Alexander Sterling, renowned architect, son of one of London's most influential families, stood in the middle of the street like an ordinary man, facing an old wound that never healed, and that now bled again, deeper, dirtier, more real. A man who had everything, then lost everything, and now discovered that perhaps he had never known anything. The city continued around him as if nothing had happened, because to the world, truly, nothing happened. Just another man standing in front of a bookstore, just another pale face in the crowd, just another story no one saw happen. But for him, there, in that instant, reality had cracked, and through that crack, he saw something he couldn't unsee. What would you do if you discovered such a life-altering secret from your past? Share your thoughts below. 6 years earlier, before the crack, before the silence, before Leo, there was a woman trying to hold together what was already crumbling. Eleanor woke up early. She made coffee, set the table with 2 cups, even when he left without touching either. She tried. That was the verb she conjugated most often alone in those days. Try. She tried to smile. She tried to talk. She tried to make Alexander look at her the same way he looked at his glass and concrete projects, with fascination and attention. But his eyes had become foreign. There was no path left. Only walls. Alexander came home late, always smelling of cigarettes and boredom. He said he was overloaded with the new bid, with the firm, with his father's pressure. But Eleanor knew it was he who was overloaded with his own coldness. She felt like someone noticing a leak in the roof, that something in her house was crumbling from within. That morning, fine rain hit the glass windows of the house in the Chelsea extension. Eleanor looked at her reflection in the mirror. Sunken eyes, dry mouth, a forgotten smudge of makeup under her chin. She decided not to cry. She bathed, pulled her hair into a hasty bun, grabbed a coat, and left. She carried a bag with freshly baked scones and an envelope. Inside, a small symbolic gift, a sketch of the project they designed together in their first month of marriage on tracing paper. They never got to build it, but Eleanor kept it. It was more than a draft. It was memory. It was roots. "I'm going to the firm. I'm going to surprise him." She said it aloud, to no one, perhaps to convince herself. She took the underground, got off at Green Park Station, walked to the commercial building where Sterling and Associates architecture firm was located. She climbed 3 flights of stairs, each slower than the last. Her heart wasn't beating fast. It was shrinking. Each step felt like a question. The hallway was silent. The main door was ajar. A sweet perfume floated in the air. It wasn't hers. She stopped. She could have knocked. She could have called out. But she pushed the door with her fingers and entered slowly. His voice was the first thing she heard, low, muffled, laughing. "If we keep this up, we're going to end up designing the wrong bed," he said, between suppressed laughs. Then, the image. She saw Alexander sitting at the project table, among papers and rulers, with the shirt half open, his secretary's fingers between the buttons. She saw them close together, laughing, their eyes closed. She saw her hand sliding down his neck as if it already knew the way. She saw the body that was once hers, belonging to another presence. And something inside her broke, but in silence. Eleanor didn't scream. She didn't run. She didn't slam the door. She didn't throw the envelope on the floor. She simply backed away, as if the scene in front of her were a fire in slow motion, as if looking too much meant letting the smell of betrayal permeate her skin. She walked down the 3 flights of stairs with chilling dignity, the bag with scones still in her hand. The envelope, left behind. She left the building like someone leaving a burning house, but on the outside, she was intact. Inside, there was no roof left, no floor. She took a taxi and didn't look back. That night, Alexander came home as usual, late, exhausted, without looking at her. He found a cold dinner on the table and a letter on the plate. 3 lines. No explanations needed. "I want distance. I want a divorce." She wasn't in the bedroom, nor in the bathroom, nor in the house. Alexander, perhaps, didn't understand at first. Maybe he thought it was a bluff, a crisis, a whim. But she didn't come back. The next day, Eleanor's lawyer called. 2 days later, the separation process had already been filed. And for the first time in years, Alexander noticed the silence. Not the silence of someone's absence, but the silence of someone who never returns. The following days were a blur that he never confessed to anyone. He deleted messages, removed photos, made excuses to friends. He said it was a mutual decision, that they were no longer on the same page. Lies told between glasses of wine and empty stares. Male pride had its own architecture, made of denial and reinforced concrete. But what he didn't know at the time was that Eleanor hadn't left out of weakness. She had left out of self-love. She had closed the door not because she no longer loved him, but because she loved herself enough not to stay there. The firm continued. The awards came. The contracts, too. But none of that filled the absence of something he only recognized after losing it. Not Eleanor's presence, but what she evoked in him when she was by his side. She made him a complete man, and now, 6 years later, he saw her. On the street, holding a child's hand, a child who had his eyes. And the crack, finally, was open. But it was long before Eleanor learned to live in the cracks. The news came without warning, on a mild late spring day. A delayed period, a strange body, a sharp intuition. She bought a pharmacy test and waited alone in the bathroom of the house she had shared with Alexander. The 2 lines appeared with cruel swiftness, without hesitation. There was the answer. She was not alone. She would never be alone again. She sat on the cold, tiled floor, the test between her fingers, her legs bent, her heart trying to organize its own beats. She should have cried. She didn't cry. She touched her flat belly with her palm and whispered, without knowing why, "You came?" The news could have been light, but an old shadow covered everything. The memory sparked in her mind. Clear. Direct, threatening. "If you get pregnant and we separate, I'll take that child from." The Sterling family has power. Never forget that. He had said that one night during an argument, long before the betrayal, when fights already replaced dinners, when she had dared to say she dreamed of children. And he, with the coldness of someone who knows the weight of a surname, cut the dream in half with that dry phrase, without hesitation. At the time, Eleanor laughed. She thought he was exaggerating. But now, with those 2 lines on the test, the phrase resonated with a different gravity. It was a threat. And more, it was a reminder of the man he really was. She spent the following days in silence. She left the house only for appointments, always at alternative times. She avoided friends, neighbors, even family. Her belly, small, could still be hidden. But fear grew. She knew what the Sterling family was capable of. She knew the power of Alexander's father, of their connections with judges, of their political influence, of the way they silenced scandals and manipulated court decisions. She had heard stories. She had seen it happen with his cousin, who lost custody of her child for having emotional instability. Instability, in that case, meant trying to leave a sick marriage. Then she understood. She couldn't stay. The decision came on a sleepless dawn. Sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands clutching the pillow to her chest, she did the math. She had little money saved, a gold bracelet her grandmother had left her, a few clothes, and the instinct to protect that little heart beating inside her. She called her mother in Brighton. She didn't explain much, just said, "I need to leave. Today? Just the 2 of us. Can it be?" On the other end of the line, there was silence. Then, a brief answer. "Always." She packed her bags in an hour. Few clothes, documents, the pregnancy test hidden between the pages of a poetry book. She left the house before the sun rose. She called a taxi. She didn't look back. The apartment, once home, was now an empty shell. Every corner still had his scent, and she could no longer stand that expensive perfume that hid so much poison. She arrived at the station with her pulse racing. She bought a one-way ticket. Getting on the train, she sat near the window, wrapped in her coat, as if it were improvised armor. She looked out as the train pulled away. The streets of London slowly faded, each street lamp a memory left behind. She arrived in Brighton shortly after noon. Her mother was at the door. She hugged her without asking questions, without demanding explanations. She just hugged her, tightly, silently, present. Eleanor cried, finally. A muffled cry, without scandalous tears. It was more a release than despair. In the first few days, she didn't leave the room. She slept a lot, or little. She spent hours with her hand on her belly, trying to imagine a future she couldn't see. Her mother cooked for two. She spoke little. It was as if she knew that silence could also be an embrace. When she finally spoke, it was a Sunday. "Do you want to tell him?" Eleanor hesitated to answer. Then she shook her head. "No, I don't want to. I can't. But he's the father. He's the danger." Her mother didn't insist. Weeks turned into months. Her belly grew. Along with it, her strength. Eleanor found a small technical drawing course offered by a local NGO. She started attending. Afterwards, she got an internship at a modest architecture firm with a kind, widowed architect who taught her more than any university. There, she wasn't Alexander Sterling's ex. She was just Eleanor, with talent, with a thirst to start over. The pregnancy was difficult. Nausea, low blood pressure, insomnia. But she endured. Each heartbeat of the baby was a reminder that she was alive, that choosing to run was choosing to live. Leo was born one hot September afternoon. The labor was long, and when she finally held him, everything around her fell silent. There was no pain, no fear, only him. His eyes opened, brown, immense, and looked at her as if they already knew her. Eleanor smiled. "You really came." That night, she wrote a single sentence in her diary. "From now on, everything is for him," and she kept her word. From that day she first held Leo, Eleanor never wavered again. Not because there was no fear. It existed. It pulsed in sleepless nights and uncertain afternoons. But she learned to use fear as fuel. Every step, every achievement, was made with the steady hands of someone carrying her own world in her lap. Leo grew up surrounded by affection. There were no luxuries, but there was firm ground. There was no powerful surname, but there was a clean, honest name. Eleanor learned to make rice and lentils in silence, to deal with night fevers without panicking, to tell stories of enchanted worlds while her own eyes were red with tiredness. At first, she lived with her mother in a small apartment on the second floor of an old building in Brighton. The room she shared with her son had peeling walls, but the windows overlooked a sky that seemed to understand her unspoken prayers. When Leo turned 2, she got a spot for him at the municipal daycare. Eleanor began working full-time at the same firm where she had interned, now as a project assistant. 3 years later, she received a partial scholarship to an architecture faculty. At night, she would sit in the tiny living room and sketch freehand while Leo slept. The lines she drew were no longer just facades or structures. They were maps of her survival. She had learned to transform absence into foundation, pain into concrete. Everything that once broke her was now part of what sustained her. She excelled. Professors saw something unusual in her, a rare mix of technical precision and contained emotion. She designed houses that seemed to understand people's emptiness. She rushed to catch up on every missed class, did assignments while washing dishes, studied during pediatric appointments, read at the edge of the bed, while Leo asked for just one more minute before falling asleep. She earned a full scholarship in her 3rd semester. Then, her first paid internship. And with that, she rented a small apartment just for them. 2 rooms, a narrow hallway, a balcony where she planted basil and lavender. She never told anyone about Alexander. Her university classmates imagined she was a widow. Some thought she had chosen to be a single mother. Eleanor didn't correct them. She didn't lie, but she didn't reveal anything either. She kept that part of her story like someone keeping broken glass, carefully, so as not to cut her fingers. For Leo's birthdays, she made simple cakes and filled the apartment with recycled balloons. In the photos, only the two of them, mother and son, a silent portrait of everything she had built, without fanfare, without help, without surnames. Sometimes, she dreamed of him. Not of Alexander, but of the child Leo might have been if he had grown up with his father's presence. In some dreams, he ran in a huge garden, holding two hands. In others, he would say, "Mommy, why didn't he come?" And Eleanor would wake up sweating, swallowing a guilt she didn't know if it was justified. But she never wavered. She never let the decision to have run away slip into regret. She knew what she had done. She knew why she had done it. And she knew that by doing so, she not only saved herself, but also saved her son from growing up in the shadow of a name that never meant protection. At 5 years old, Leo asked for the first time, "Mommy, why don't I have a daddy?" Eleanor knelt down, held his face in her hands, and replied, "Because you have me, and I never left you." Leo didn't reply. He just rested his head on her shoulder. And in that embrace, Eleanor understood that love was also a language spoken with presence. In her final year of university, she presented her thesis project, a social housing project focused on single mothers. The jury was silent for a few seconds after the presentation. Then, they applauded. Her supervisor hugged her eyes wet. She left the room with the feeling of having rebuilt everything that had once been demolished. She got a job at an architecture firm focused on social projects. It wasn't Alexander's award-winning firm, but it was a space where her voice carried weight. She bought a used bicycle, took Leo to school by cycling. On Saturdays, they frequented the same ice cream parlor on the corner. She always ordered vanilla. He, chocolate mint. It was the only fixed habit of the week, the ritual of remembering that life also needed sweetness. And so, with small, dignified steps, Eleanor got there. A strong woman, mother of a child who smiled with his whole being, an admired professional, owner of her own story. She won, and she didn't need Emma or anyone to see it for it to be true. But now someone saw. Alexander. The image of the child wouldn't leave his head, so vivid it hurt. The features, the walk, the attentive silence that he himself had at 5 years old. The eyes. God. The eyes. As if time had folded back on itself and given Alexander a mirror of a past he never lived, but that now looked at him through the streets of London with an implacable naturalness. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a projection. It was the truth. In the days that followed the fleeting reunion, Alexander tried to convince himself that he didn't need to know more. He tried because he knew what would come next. Guilt, fear, shame. But he failed. In his firm, he drew lines on drawing boards that led nowhere. At night, he read reports he didn't retain. He started sentences and left them unfinished. When someone asked him if he was okay, he automatically replied with a clear yes, but inside, everything was noise. He ordered an investigation. He hired someone discreet. He asked them to track Eleanor, but without invading, without causing a scandal. 2 days later, he received an envelope in hand. Brighton, Kemptown neighborhood. Her mother's name as the apartment owner, the child's school, a first semester report card, enrollment photo. Name, Leo Harrison. He didn't carry his surname, but the face was enough. Alexander stood there, paralyzed, with the documents on the table, as if observing the record of a life he never participated in. And with that, The inevitable question. What would he do with it? He called his chauffeur, asked him to prepare the car for a trip. I need time to think, he said, but what he wanted, deep down, was time to undo. The drive to Brighton was long, though short in miles. The car seemed smaller, the air denser. He didn't speak during the 4-hour drive. He just watched the landscape change, his face motionless. He thought of Eleanor, of the courage she had to disappear, of the courage he never had to be someone different. He arrived at the address. A discreet street, low-rise buildings, children playing on the sidewalk. He got out slowly, his hands damp. He climbed the steps in silence. The doorbell was simple, round. He rang it once, and waited. When the door opened, the image in front of him disarmed him. Eleanor, her hair shorter, her face more mature, but her eyes, the same, intense, clear, strong. She didn't seem surprised. She looked at him as if she had been expecting him, as if she already knew that someday this moment would come. "Alexander," she said, without emotion. He didn't respond immediately. He just looked at her as if he still couldn't believe she was there. Real? Alive? Unattainable? "He's my son, isn't he?" The question came out like a stone. There was no accusatory tone, only truth, and an old fear mixed with a new one. Eleanor didn't look away. She didn't move. She just took a deep breath, firm. "Yes, Leo is your son, but he is my world." The words fell between them like a verdict. For an instant, neither of them spoke. The silence grew louder. The sound of the street in the background, a dog barking, a ball bouncing on the asphalt. Everything seemed distant, as if they were isolated inside thick glass. Alexander tried to organize a thought, but his body spoke first. Trembling hands, dry throat, a weight on his chest. He didn't know if he could enter. He didn't know if he should. "Why didn't you tell me?" She managed a bitter smile. Her eyes remained fixed on his, but there was a weariness there that hadn't existed before. "Do you remember what you told me, a year before everything ended? If you get pregnant and we separate, I'll take that child from you. The Sterling family has power. Never forget that." Alexander closed his eyes. He remembered. The phrase was real. He said it in anger on any given night, and he never thought she would take it seriously. "Eleanor, you don't need to explain yourself." She interrupted him with a gentle but firm gesture. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because he needs me whole, and I could only be whole away from you." The words were like clean blades. There were no shouts, no tears, but each syllable carried the pain of years. "Does he know about me? Not yet. And when he does, it will be at the right time. My time. Can I see him?" She hesitated for the first time. Her eyes wavered, her body moved slightly. "He's at the park with my mother. He'll be back in half an hour. You can see him, but don't confuse things." "What things?" She looked at him deeply and replied, "You can be a father, but I am all he knows, and I'm not going to let that change." Alexander nodded, his gaze lowered. There was no room for disputes there. Only one possible path, to enter the other's territory with respect. And he, finally, was ready to tread carefully. And at that moment, there, standing on the threshold of the door that had been closed to him for so long, Alexander felt what he had never truly felt. Guilt. Not theatrical, performative guilt, but the guilt that hurts because it recognizes, that burns because it's true, that silences because it knows it has been wrong. Eleanor stepped aside, making space for him to enter. And so, without rituals, without hugs, without promises. The story began to reopen. Alexander entered Eleanor's apartment with the same feeling of invading a sanctuary. It was a small, modest space, but clean, alive. The furniture didn't match, but every object seemed to have been placed there with an intimate purpose. There were children's drawings taped to the fridge, a plant on the windowsill, a crooked lamp next to a worn armchair, and in the center of it all, the subtle scent of lavender, the same she used on her pillow when they still slept together. Though now it seemed like a different perfume, more mature, more hers. "Do you want some water?" Eleanor asked, already in the kitchen, her back to him. "Yes, please." She brought him a glass without looking him in the eye. Alexander took it with both hands, as if holding something fragile. The tension between them filled the space with an almost physical presence. He didn't know if he should praise the place, ask about Leo, apologize, or just keep quiet. He chose silence, which at that moment seemed the only honest form of respect. Minutes later, the sound of the gate downstairs. Eleanor went to the window. "It's my mother with him. They're coming up now." Alexander rested the glass on the table. His heart began to pound, a kind of tachycardia he didn't know. It wasn't fear of rejection. It was something more primitive, an anxiety to find a reflection that confirmed that, no matter how much he had failed, something of him could still remain. Leo entered holding his grandmother's hand, his face sweaty, his hair messy from the wind. He carried a toy car in his other hand, distracted. When he saw Alexander, he stopped. His eyes, brown, dark, fixed on the man's with an almost adult seriousness. And in that instant, Alexander felt something stir. It wasn't recognition. It was as if the two looked into each other's souls. "Leo," Eleanor said softly, "this is a friend of Mommy's." Leo kept looking. Then he let go of his grandmother's hand, walked towards Alexander with short, firm steps, stopped a meter away, and asked, "Are you going to stay here?" Alexander knelt down, trying to keep his eyes at the child's level. "Just for a little while, if you let me." Leo looked at his mother, then at his grandmother. Then he nodded. "All right, but don't touch my cars. Deal?" And that's how it started. In the days that followed, Alexander slowly began to appear, first at the park, then at quick lunches. He brought picture books, toy cars, drawings. Leo always watched him with suspicion at first, like someone testing the limits of a presence. But it wasn't long before he started calling him by his name. And then, with an intimacy that Alexander didn't know could hurt, the child said, "You look like me." Alexander felt his stomach churn. He smiled, but his gaze betrayed the internal turmoil. Eleanor watched everything from a distance. She never intervened, but she also never absented herself. She remained firm as a dividing line between what was past and what was now necessary. There was no affection in her eyes when she looked at Alexander, only vigilance, as if he were a storm she knew too well. One afternoon at the park, Leo was playing with another child, and his grandmother had gone to buy water. Eleanor was sitting on a bench, reading a book. Alexander approached and stood beside her. "May I?" he asked, pointing to the empty space next to her. She nodded, without looking up from the page. They sat in silence for minutes, the sound of the children in the background, the birds, the rustling of leaves moved by the wind. Then Alexander spoke, without thinking too much. "He's beautiful." "I know," she replied, still without looking. "You did an incredible job with him." Now she looked at him, a direct, clear, but cutting gaze. "I did what I had to do. I wish I had been there." Eleanor took a deep breath. She closed the book. "Don't say that as if it were my choice. You know what you said. You know what you did. You know what you lost. I know. But no buts. He swallowed. I know I can't erase the past, but I can try to build something new. Not with you, with him. Eleanor observed him for seconds that seemed like hours. Then she spoke, her voice firm. Only if you remember every day that the priority is him, not you, not your surname, not your guilt. Understood. And one more thing, she continued, without changing her tone. Don't try to fix what was between us. It's already dead, and I buried it. Alexander was silent. He looked at the ground, then at Leo, running with a wide, innocent smile. And there, he saw what Eleanor meant. The future wasn't about redemption. It was about responsibility. And beside that woman he once loved, he understood finally that she wasn't just his son's mother. She was unbreakable, and that he could never achieve. Alexander understood. Not in the arrogant way of someone who finally understands a woman, but as someone who, after a long time, recognized the exact void he left behind. And the hardest thing to accept was that Eleanor was no longer in that void. She filled it alone. With silence, with struggle, with her own hands. With the precise architecture of someone who learned to build from the rubble. He saw it now. In her every gesture, in the way she organized Leo's life with a firm and affectionate routine, in the way she spoke to her school colleagues in a confident voice, without fear of judgment, in the way she wore simple clothes that seemed tailor-made, as if her body had learned to fit exactly where it wanted to. Eleanor flourished, and he was just a spectator. Alexander began to accompany Leo more frequently. He took his son to the park on alternate Saturdays. Eleanor's mother supervised him with eagle eyes, never hostile, but always attentive. Eleanor trusted her instincts. It was like an invisible network of protection. The child would never be completely alone with Alexander. There would always be a watchful eye nearby, and Alexander never complained about it. He accepted it, because he knew he had no right to ask for more than that. One morning, after dropping Leo off at school, Alexander saw Eleanor across the street. She wore a blue skirt, low heels, a folder under her arm, and a cup of coffee in her hand. She was talking on the phone, concentrated, walking quickly. She was so clear, so solid in that instant, that Alexander stopped to observe. He saw in her a woman he didn't know, a woman that time had sculpted with precision. She crossed the street, hung up the phone, and saw him. She stopped in front of him. Her eyes weren't cold. They were serene, like someone who expects nothing anymore. And precisely because of that, she doesn't need to protect herself. "Do you need anything?" she asked simply. "No," he replied, hesitant. I was going to say you're different. I'm alive. That's it. And you're learning to see." She walked past him without waiting for a reply. And that resonated with him as a reminder. Some pains don't heal. They transform. And Eleanor transformed. Later that same day, Alexander opened his laptop and searched her name. He found an article. Eleanor Hayes, architect and urban planner, winner of a regional award for a sustainable social housing project. The text spoke of her with reverence. It mentioned her training, her career, her focus on vulnerable communities. No influential surnames, no inheritances. It was all merit. Every paragraph, a confirmation of what he was already beginning to accept. Eleanor not only survived, she became someone else. And he remained rich. He continued signing projects, accumulating awards, attending gala dinners. But all that he carried in his pockets, the contacts, the promises, the contracts, now seemed lighter than a dry leaf compared to the concrete weight of the presence Eleanor had conquered with her own story. The power of the Sterling family? Impotent there. Because Eleanor was no longer accessible through influence. She could not be bent by surnames. She was not for sale. Alexander understood. Not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. And looking at Leo, watching him grow with the tenderness of someone who was loved unconditionally, he understood that all that Eleanor built, the balance, the clarity, the unconditional love, cannot be bought. It cannot be inherited. It can only be conquered. And he arrived too late. If you were in Eleanor's shoes, would you have done the same? Would you have left, without telling him about the pregnancy? Comment below. I really want to know what you would do. And if this story touched you in any way, like the video. Subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear this. See you in the next story.